Okay. They disappeared. Okay. There were people here. Did I kick them out? Oh, here.
I'm sure. Well, it's
No,
always...
I know. I'm just, it was just funny that they were here before and then they disappeared. So hi, welcome. Thank you for joining. As people slowly come in, one of the things I do like about Zoom is that it doesn't matter if people are late. Like nobody's coming in and walking in front of you and opening and closing the door, like when you're in a live lecture. Although I definitely prefer live lectures. I'm just saying this is one of the benefits here. So thank you for joining. Those of you who are here on time, we always appreciate that. If you want to put into the chat where you're signing in from, so we know where in the world people are signing in from, that's always helpful. And today, this is where I am. It's always interesting also where you're from today as opposed to where you're normally from. Now, that you don't have to, you can decide what you want to say. And if you already have something that you're hoping to get from today, we'd love to hear that as well. So you can throw that in to the chat as well. Get us started. We'll give everybody about another 3 or 4 minutes to come in. Again, those who are here on time, we appreciate that. Just get a little organized. Oh, nobody's telling us today where they're. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Ivana. So we have from London. Yeah, we usually have a pretty international audience, so we appreciate that. Where are you today, Roger?
Oh, today I'm in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and it's absolutely a perfect day. It's always sunny and nice and cold.
Okay. Cold without snow to me doesn't do it. Either I like cold and snow or warm. Like just cold doesn't do it, but that's okay. You can enjoy it. Sun is good though.
I think the problem is I'm a native of Texas, and I'm so sick and tired of the heat. But it's like anytime there's a little bit of cold and sun, this
I
is
hear that.
the perfect combination.
I definitely hear that. So those who are just joining, we're just shooting the breeze a little bit for the next 2-3 minutes until we allow some people. We have a little stragglers and more people will come throughout. But in the meantime, thank you for being on time. And if you throw into the chat where you're signing in from, and again, if there's something you were hoping to hear today or planning to hear or would like to hear in the future, that works as well. So we can get a little chat going also in the background. It's always a trade-off if you wait for people, because then the next time they're going to be another 5 minutes late, and then but I like to give the 5-minute cushion, so because I'm usually 5 minutes late.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when people are coming in from across everywhere, it's always like, getting everything to work at the last minute, kind of settling down in your space,
Exactly.
getting ready. It's not like when you go to a lecture at a physical location, right? Because when we're in a location, everybody's kind of settling in, you start to get focused, you start to put away your phone, and it allows you to be ready and receptive versus like in the house, like all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I got to get going.
Running in from the kitchen or running in from somewhere else. I agree. But we're still gonna give, okay. So let's see. People are being shy today, not sharing with us, but that's okay. We'll get them talking, hopefully. Okay. Oh, thank you. Getting us started in some discussion. Appreciate it. Good evening. Good morning. And we're going to start with who's here. Like I said, it doesn't bother us if people come in the middle because we don't hear.
Absolutely.
I'll be aware though. So, and Okay. So, first of all, formally, welcome you all for coming and thank you for joining us. We are excited to continue our series on Sephardic roots with this program on Sephardic families. Today we have a new presenter to our program, not new in general to presenting. It's Dr. Roger Martínez-Dávila. And little personal tidbit is I was first introduced to Roger over Coursera, where I went to one of his MOOCs, his open online classes, which was fascinating, trying to go through some of the manuscripts. And I learned a lot there. So I appreciate that. And actually introduced me to the whole Inquisition era manuscript conversation. So it was really appreciated. So thank you. He has written quite a bit. He has lectured quite a bit. I like this. I'm going to add it in that the first book you said was shaped by your late father's questions, who are we? And that was called Creating Conversos, the Carvajal-Santa María Family in early modern Spain. And I'm going to let you speak for yourself since I don't want to take too much of your time. So again, thank you, Roger, and thank you all for coming. I just want to give one more technical thing before you begin. Please do continue to write in the chat. I will be monitoring it. And if there are questions, either throw them in the chat or the Q&A. And after the formal presentation, I will ask them unless there's something urgent. So thank you again. And it's over to you.
Great. Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. It's great to be here with y'all. These are always the most important events for me. You'd be surprised. It's not to actually attend an academic conference and present my research, present ideas with other colleagues. It's actually to visit with the community. That's who I care about. And so I really appreciate your time today. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my presentation and I'll drop into like a little bubble. You'll notice in a second, but I'm still here. And let me see if I can get this to go ahead and play. It's a great thing about Zoom. It hides everything from you.
Play from start. There we go.
There we go. And can you see that?
We do see that, and we see you. Oh, no. Now we're in the wrong screen.
Oh,
Now we
really?
see the one with your notes.
That's too bad. Well, then I will try to fix this real quick here. I'm going to share my screen a different way. Share my desk. Let me try that way. And then, are you still seeing my notes?
We do see your notes, and we don't see presentation mode.
Great. Just want to make sure.
Thank you all for your patience. I promise you it'll be worth it.
And is that presentation mode?
That is presentation mode. Perfect.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for your patience with me. I love technology so much. I really do. And then it doesn't work. All right. I'm just going to open up my notes. So again, I am, and are you still seeing presentation?
Not when you open your notes, it goes back to us seeing your notes.
Okay. There's another way I can do this. One more way. Oh. Best way to do this.
While he's doing that, just those who are just joining us, thank you. Remember, put your where you're signing in from, anything you want to add to the conversation, throw it into the chat. If you have questions, throw it into the Q&A, and I'll be monitoring it. We're just a little bit of technical issues, but we will get there in a minute.
If I see if I can do it this way, then. And then might have to just show you my notes, and I'm sorry about that. because I don't want to delay any longer.
Right.
Oh, wait.
It's strange that you should be able to have both. There should be two different screens there.
Yeah, I know. It usually works great, and except when it doesn't.
Right. No, I say technology is wonderful until it isn't. That's it. Slide. Right. So now we see it perfectly.
I'm going to try my notes again one last time. And if not, I'll just go by memory. And you still see notes, right?
We see notes, yes.
Okay, that's fine. I've memorized it anyway. It's always kind of crazy when these things happen. So if you will help me, since my presentation timer is not working properly, if I may ask you to just give me a 10-minute warning so that I can properly stick to time. And that way we can move forward.
Sure.
Today, what I wanted to do is just speak a little bit about Sephardic families between Judaism and Christianity. And my name is Roger Martínez-Dávila. I'm a professor of history, focusing on Sephardic Jews and Conversos, their descendants, at the University of Colorado. I've also, my degree is from the University of Texas at Austin, but I have spent time in Jesuit universities, also Spanish universities as well. And I kind of started here because I wanted to show this depiction. This is a Goya painting of like an inquisitional scene, because I think this is the tension really we're dealing with inside of Sephardic families, which is between the two faith groups, between the two religious groups. And on the one hand, we see up in the upper left-hand corner, we see a depiction of a statue of Mary. And then we see the penitentes, the penance individuals who are being pulled through the streets at probably an auto de fe or an act of faith, when they would have these big presentations of individuals who have relapsed into Judaism or other types of heresy, which I always love to kid my students that, yes, if you are a Protestant, you're a heretic as well. Not just Jews, not just Jews who have converted and the like. So the first thing I would like to show is just several stories. The origins of the Sepharad and Sephardic Jews, the problems embedded in our understanding of Spanish history, and then also kind of thinking about, for Sephardic families, those who converted to Christianity, this kind of religious and violent tension that culminated in the Inquisition in 1478 and then the expulsion. One of the pieces we want to really kind of take a look at is actually this kind of long Renaissance period, because a lot of this history doesn't make sense unless we're taking in this long durée of history, which is between the 1300s and 1600s. There is this Renaissance moment when we've been bequeathed like new opportunities for ourselves, new opportunities to create new possibilities of identity. Unfortunately, the aftermath of that are fragmented identities. So our story really begins with, when we think about it, with the Torah. How did a Spanish Jewish community come together? And we know that began with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, or the Common Era, when Titus's troops destroyed the Second Temple and forced Jews from their homeland, and there was the giant diaspora across the Mediterranean world. And in this respect, we even have, these original artifacts. This is in Rome, and you can imagine there is this this ark of Titus, and even shows the depiction of the menorah being carried off by the soldiers. So this is the moment really then we start to see that a Sephardic people is going to come together. And when they do come to Spain, and there was already an ancient community there, they do encounter the Visigoth peoples. But what we know the most about really is about that Islamic golden period for Sephardic Jews, when there was this really brilliant intellectual, agricultural, technological fluorescence around many different cultures together. And it's a great contrast to what we see in the contemporary world today, where Jews occupied this incredible space of intermediary between Christians, maybe on the right, that might be visiting a court, and this is the Caliphate of Cordoba, or vice versa, Muslims visiting with Christians and Jews, helping to facilitate those relationships. As we know, though, the Islamic period was not, a perfect period as well. And we receive information from folks like Moses Maimonides, who wrote a guide for the perplexed. This is actually ink on parchment, a manuscript that is kept in the National Libraries of Spain. We know that it's obviously originally from the 12th century, but this copy written in Hebrew, we see, is that important message that we hear from these intolerant time periods, which is it's important for us to kind of move through society, doing the best we can as Sephardic Jews, but also recognize that we will be under an intense persecution at times, and at times that might require us to kind of hide our faith, hide our religion, so that we can proceed into the future, that we don't go extinct. One of the time periods that is most interesting for me as we start to think about the late Middle Ages, which is roughly the 1300s to the 1500s, or places like El Tránsito Museum, which was El Tránsito synagogue that was founded in the 1340s, 50s by the Levy family. And here we see the building on the left-hand side, but on the inside, we see this incredible depiction. And this is, I think, the story of the Sephardic people inside of Spain, is this intermingling of so many things. So in the center screen, we see this beautiful stucco depiction with all these vegetative mudahar or Islamic art forms, which are incredible. But then we see this heraldic device in the center where we see the castles and lions, meaning this is a royal synagogue under the direction of the kingdom, the Castilian kings. And then very interestingly, we can see at the bottom of the stucco, this inscription in Hebrew. And this is just the dedication plaque for the Levy family when they founded the document. What's particularly interesting is you see in the last image on the right-hand side is you'll see a little fleur de lis or flores de lilio. And this was the heraldic device that the Santa Maria family and the Levy family, the same ones, Catholics and Jewish levies, used. It was actually probably adopted when they were with their relationships with France. But also there is an older element of the fleur de lis that we actually find even in Judea. So it may have been an ancient symbol for the family. My point here is to start to think about religious artifacts and objects that exist in the built environment, so that we're reading this like language. And this one is a language of intermixing of Islamic art forms, of Castilian and Catholic like rule, but clearly a Jewish environment, a Jewish way of living. Now, the problem for the Sephardic communities and Sephardic families is the issue of violence. And we know that by the 1200s, Jews across Europe were already being targeted by many different kind of communities. Often it was about economic and political competition. And we know from scholars such as Robert Moore, who wrote a book called The Formation of Persecution in Europe. And this book talks about basically, because Jews were the learned class and they were they had so many different skill sets and were so accomplished in languages, they were invaluable actually in royal courts. And this often created tensions with Christian clerics who wanted to have their places in society. And it creates this kind of embedded anti-Semitism that lives on till today. Well, the real moment of truth, really, for the Sephardic community in Spain is in the 1300s. And then in the 1300s, three momentous events happened. One, they experienced a pandemic like we did, which changed everything. The Great Plague, where at least a million Spaniards died in the 1360s. It also happened to kill the king of Castile and created a massive civil war inside of Castile. One on the one side, we had Pedro the Cruel, who was the king's real son. And then on the other side, his son, who was a bastard, who was Enrique of Trastamara. And those two came to fight in a brutal war, blaming each other constantly for using Jews and their administrations while simultaneously relying on them. In the end, who wins is Enrique de Trastamara, who is the direct ancestor of none other than Isabel la Católica, the Catholic. So it's a great irony there. As we know, in the 1300s then, as the Black Death is taking effect, there's this anti-Semitism just goes off the charts. And the sense of Jews are blamed not only for blood libel, but also for poisoning of wells, of actually possibly creating the Black Death, which was ridiculous. And across Spain, by the 1390s, we have massive anti-Jewish riots. There would be referred to as pogroms in this time period. And in this sense, we know that as many as 100,000 Jews may have been massacred, 100,000 may have converted to Christianity, and 100,000 may have left the peninsula, creating a crisis for these communities, for these families of what do we do now? What do we do now? How do we survive? And so now the story is going to bifurcate. I'm going to tell you two different stories. Most of it is through the lens of Conversos and understanding how Jews who converted to Christianity decided to find a way forward. And there would be aspects of the Jewish life in there, but we start to see this evaporation. And this is the difficulty of tracking this history of Sephardic families. So why am I showing you a picture of a manuscript that clearly looks to be a Christian manuscript? Well, one of the dirty little secrets about Spanish history is that at the end of that Civil War, Castile was devastated. The population had shrunk. The nobility had been decimated in terms of its arms, its monies, and as well as its people. And what did Enrique de Trastamara do? He turned to elite Jews and said, I will make you a deal. If you convert to Christianity, I will make you you will no longer be a noble in itself. You will be a high noble, a member of the grandeza, the grand nobility. Moreover, what I will do, which was very unusual at the time period, was he granted families like the Levy family. In this case, this is a picture of the Estoniga count from Behar. And in this case, the family converted to Christianity and then assembled a massive wealth so substantial that in 1 year in the 1450s, their properties were so extensive across Iberia that they collected 1 million silver pieces in rents alone from lands that they own, properties they own, houses they rented out. And this was really the challenge in this period, which is for Sephardic Jews, they had already been so integrated into royal courts. And there was this massive need for new leadership that some chose to drift away. They chose to make new decisions about their future. So this is where we kind of start to arrive at the Inquisition and really what is this all about? So my colleague, Dr. Richard Kagan, also I would mention Jane Gerber, who has a fantastic book on the Jews of Spain. What we find in the 1400s is this new focus on these populations that are mixed, that are problematic, that families that no longer are Jewish or Christian, they're somewhere in between. And we even have cases where we look at manuscripts where we see Jewish and Catholic family members living in the same homes. and across Spain, that the idea of a walled off Judaria, a Jewish quarter, was impossible because the families were so intermixed. And so this is where it's quite unusual, where we see, well, to talk about a Sephardic life is actually to talk about a Christian life and how they live together. And so in this respect, it is about common ways of life, common ways of production of constantly. The pieces I look at are the production of wine, the tending of vineyards, the production of, actually, we don't think of Jewish families in this way, but of agricultural producers who are working alongside of Christians, creating not necessarily a utopia, but somewhere in between. And even in some cases, families that were Jewish who were so important to the Christians that they relied upon to create actually the arms for creating plate mail and chain mail for Christian knights. You don't trust someone with your life in that way unless there's a strong bond. Unfortunately, the 1450s changed all this. Catholics became incredibly concerned about the history of mixing of peoples. And in manuscripts, what we start to find is all this new nobility, they were descended from Jewish ancestors. And you can see this arrow to the left up here, and that points to the name Yusef. And this is Don Yusef, who is a Levi. And then this is a document that for the Estuniga family from the late 13 and early 1400s that they kept because they wanted to make sure their lands would always pass along. But they generally had this information. Similarly, what we see are these mixings of families where we start off with the Levi family at the top, but over time, they start to convert into Catholicism. And the beauty of Judaism that, rabbis can have children, then you have Pablo de Santa Maria, who becomes a bishop in Burgos. Another son becomes a bishop in Presencia, another one in Cartagena. And then also we have even like monastery directors, abbots. And so these were like this process of integration. What's really interesting is we always know how these families are living is they're also kind of hiding their backgrounds. So this is a manuscript that's a copy of a 1300s manuscript. But here what we see, which is quite interesting, is on one side of the manuscript where we had these church leaders who are, for all practical purposes of the time period, because of limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, are Jewish. They would be considered Jewish inside Christian society because of their stained blood. Actually running the cathedral. So Gil Gutierrez, who is a mayordomo, and he's like a church prelate. This is an economic record where he's leasing something. And on the other side, we see his son, Juan Fernandez de Cabreros. The names totally changed because they're trying to disappear into society. This whole effort really then of families then that are Sephardic families becomes one of concealment. And so this is actually a genealogical chart from probably the 1700s where we're tracking. You can see the family is tracking itself. This is the Carvajals, who are Levies. And later on, you can see where sections where they've cut pieces out. And the reason why was the history, their stories had to be secret. And this is how this manifests. We get individuals like Cardinal Bernardino Lopez de Carvajal, who was a Roman Catholic cardinal in the late 1400s and early 1500s. He actually sat as an anti-pope to one of the popes and almost and was named a pope for 2 to 3 weeks until the Machiavelli convinced him to step down. And then later, was almost elected the Pope in the early 1500s. And in that case, this descendant of the Levies would have been, in many practical senses, the very first Jewish Pope of the Catholic Church, because he had stained blood. There was no way to get rid of that. So what we do find ourselves then is moving into the Inquisitional period, So by 1478, the Inquisition is founded, and by 1480, it is investigating individuals. By 1492, we find the expulsion of the Jews taking place. This is an actual copy of the Edict of Expulsion, often known also as the Alhambra Decree, and this is from 1492. And one of the little interesting elements about this expulsion, though, and if we're thinking about families and about mixtures, was that the dirty little secret about the Roman Catholic monarchs, the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabel, was that Ferdinand actually had a Jewish pedigree as well. But it was actually the Conversos around him that destroyed the historical record. They destroyed what we no longer can see today. And in the Academy, the Royal Academy of History, the archives in Madrid today on Calle de Leon, we actually have manuscripts that detail how his genealogy was manipulated. So this is where it's very kind of confusing, which is, well, who's who really in this world? And that's where I come back to the material culture. Is it the Levy family that we see in their synagogue on the right? Or is it the Santa Maria family? Are these good Catholics? What are they? We don't know, actually. And this is the problem, really, of human possibilities in the Renaissance. So this is the big picture, which I think is important for all of us to appreciate as Sephardic Jews and as conversos and those that are interested in, is that one of the most miraculous things that came out of the plague was a new possibility of self-fashioning. This is a book by Stephen Greenblatt. There's been a lot of scholarship around this era, which basically makes the argument that in the 1300s through the 1600s, what was happening inside of Europe was people were breaking away from what they used to be. We all know that old adage, which is, once, your father's a cobbler, you will be a cobbler. If you are come from one kind of background, you stay that background. That was the medieval continuity, and that applied to religion as well. Well, what happens in the 1300s, especially when the Sephardic community is under so much stress and having to figure out ways of surviving, and the way that Maimonides instructed us to do, was that they started to create new versions of themselves. And in many respects, the Jews of Spain in the 1300s were the quintessential example of a new Renaissance person, because they were living in between two worlds that were Catholic and Jewish and something in between. And they were no longer just a category of Jewish inside of like communities. There were nobles, they were leaders in the community, and they lived kind of hybridized lives. So this is very special to understand, because if we think about the Renaissance, we think about maybe Dante, or we think about Michelangelo, or Leonardo da Vinci. Yes, we have them. But if you want to think about the perfect example of what would become the human possibility that we live today, it is Sephardic Jews. They took the leap. They took the leap that was fateful. So we find that even in churches across Spain, and this is one in Plasencia, where we get this mixtures of messages. We have the Santa Maria Levy fleur de lis here, the family signaling, this is who we are. But alongside of it, the black sable band of the Carvajales. And in many places in Spain, what will happen, and this is what is said about this one, is like, oh, the fleur de lis is an old symbol for the Carvajals, that they never actually, that's for one of the elements. They actually won't acknowledge that the Santa Marias, the Levies, had intermarried with an old Christian family. And this particular chapel is very interesting, because on its sides, which we can't see here, were two depictions of saints in the Catholic Church, one of Ambrose and one of Augustine. Ambrose was the welcoming party in the medieval church, saying to bring in converts. And Augustine was the convert who was vicious in his attempts to proselytize. This is the tension that kind of exist in Sephardic families and Converso families in Spain and in the Americas for that part is, which one are we? How do we be tolerant of ourselves, but also become something new and turn the page? It's a fractured identity. It's an impossibility. So this is where I would talk just a little bit about the city of Plasencia and where we could see what does that mixture look like. This is a depiction from the 1500s of the city. In the center, you'll see center top, you'll see a big O, that's the Plaza Mayor. If you look towards the upper left, you'll see an F on a large building. This is the Juraria. And then if you look towards the left in the middle of the page, far left, you'll see the picture of the cathedral. This is the old cathedral of Plasencia. And what was so special about it was the communities that were inside of it, where Levies and Carvajales were two families that had intermarried. And this is a map actually of the community that I drew to communicate this piece. So if you look at this one, you see the Jewish Alhama, the Juraria, and there's a red dotted line that circles it. So it's this upper left-hand quadrant. And all the homes that are occupied by Jewish individuals are pinkish red. And then we have others that have like bicolors of white and red. So under the administration of these Converso families in Plasencia, the Juraria continued to exist as it did always. But also Jews started to live in Christian homes. And so that's where you see the multicolored red and white or red and green homes. So red and white ones are owned by the church, where the church is fully okay with Jews living in their homes or mixed families. And then the red and green ones are actually, those are Christian noblemen's homes that are rented to Jewish families. So what we also see though, is you see this really large yellow image of Estuniga. Then we see other names like Amarez or Alvarez. Also, what we know is that Christian noblemen and Christian families were living deeply inside of the Jewish quarter. So which is it? Is there mixing? Is there not mixing? What is actually Sephardic family? What is Christian family? And if you think about it, you'll see the synagogue in the upper left-hand corner. The rabbis that lived there probably had more interaction with the Christian populations in this area than the Christian churchmen who live closer to the cathedral. So it really kind of scatters our thinking about this. So some of the pieces that I'm going to start to just finish up with and move to the Americas a little bit is that what we find is intertwined practices and secrecy in cathedral affairs. So for instance, in 1437, the descendants of the Levies enacted secrecy statutes for their church leaders to meet. And they said they would meet in private and no one was ever to reveal their discussions. And when were they meeting? They chose to meet on Friday nights at the cathedral, and only families that were related were invited to attend, and there were no excuses for missing this perhaps opening of the Sabbath. The other piece that's really quite fascinating is that they also devoted new masses not to Christ, but actually devoted masses to Mary. So I think there's also this new trend that we see for Sephardic Jews that are moving to Christianity and backwards. There's this connection maybe to Miriam, maybe to Moses' sister, to this way of going in between and not focusing on Christ. And we even see this in material artifacts where in the old cathedral, we have this depiction of Mary and the Christ child. And it's a very unusual painting that was painted in the 1300s, probably repainted over in the 1400s of this time period where I was looking at. And they're looking out of the picture towards the floor. And you know who's buried in the floor? One of the former Jewish rabbis, who is now a Catholic churchman alongside of Sarah de Carvajal. And so this mixture of families exists there in the cathedral, that there's somewhere in between.
10-minute warning.
Thank you. Perfect. So I just kind of wanted to conclude a little bit, taking this into the New World. So what we know about Spain is this deterioration of events, that we're going to have the Edict of Expulsion. There's this last flurry of mixing of communities, but it's not going to last. And that's why the Inquisition is so devastating. What we do know is that the Conversos come to the New World. And when they come with Cortez and the rest, what we find is a new opening for Carvajales and Conversos of all different stripes that will come into the New World, conquering and also assimilating new populations. At the end of this process, what is very interesting is that we know that Converso families are banned. So here, the king, issues royal edicts that ban all Sephardic Jews and their descendants from coming to the New World. And of course, Conversos and Sephardic families are very intelligent. They hide the truth. They hide behind what are nobility patents that make them appear as good Catholics of old pedigree, when in fact they aren't. And there's this constant devotion to Mary, never about Christ, but always about Mary, kind of almost a misdirection. And then here is another kind of nobility patent for an American family, Spanish American family, showing they come from a knight, the tree comes from it, and that breaks off into new branches. Very interestingly, they're managing their genealogies. They show one main lineage going up, and they show the other ones dying off. What's missing here? We don't know. I just want to wrote over here. So the last piece of the story is really thinking about the 1500s in Spain, New Spain, and the arrival of the Spanish Inquisition there, the Mexican Inquisition. What was not known really previously, and we all know the story of Luis de Carvajal, who was executed in the 1590s alongside of his family members and his mother and sisters, except for one daughter, one sister, was that they had returned fully to Judaism, that they had found their way home. What wasn't known was that alongside of the Carvajales, who were investigated for crypto-Judaism, was another arm of the Carvajal family that was populating not only the bishopric of Mexico City, but also were working as inquisitors. And this one is for Leonel Cervantes de Carvajal. He was an inquisitor alongside of the Peralta family that investigated the Carvajals. And it turns out in the procesos, and ones what we can see, and this is for Leonardo de Carvajal, what I was able to understand about this family, my own family, was that it investigated itself. Finally, in the 1500s, the story had caught up with them. And the Catholic side of the family had decided they had to turn the full page. And that full page meant executing the other side of the family. So we lose Luis de Carvajal. We lose his mother and his sisters. The only one surviving is actually Mariana. And Mariana, of all people, she was placed into the protective custody of a good Catholic family so that she would be reconciled to the faith. Again, another piece that we didn't know that I found out later was that she was placed in an extended family member's home to reconcile her back to Christianity, and she would not return to Christianity. She remained a steadfast practitioner of Judaism. And that's how the story ends. So what are we to make of this? What are we to make of Sephardic communities in this sense, and families? It is a story of fracture. It is a story of living in between. And it is a story of trying to return home and knowing at times that won't be possible. Some will lose their lives because of their beliefs, and others will turn their back on them. And it is the stain of my own family. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, that was a little. So I'm gonna give everybody a few minutes to kind of process, or a minute to process. I'm gonna talk for a moment, and then we'll get into some questions, which there are some, and I had some. But before we get into that, I just want to thank our partners for today. We have Jeannie Milgram, we have the Certificate of Sephardic Ancestry, we have um, my own Jewish Unity Through Diversity, and Reconnectar. So if you don't know any of our partners, please do check them out. This is part of our series, Sephardic Roots Throughout the Ages, and we're very excited to do this. So next week we have Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Pereira speaking, and Dr. Martinez will be back with us on January 8th talking about manuscripts. But it's fairly frequently, we're having a few a month, so we really hope to see you back here. That's my little spiel to bring in a Yiddish word into our Sephardi discussion. Have to do something, right? But I just want to, I'm going to start, and please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A and into the chat. But I want you to clarify something before we even get into some of the deeper questions. You said Ferdinand had Jewish lineage and that the crypto Jews destroyed it. Is that what I heard?
So there's an issue of language here, right? So I'm going to use the language of conversos, right? So crypto
Okay.
Jews are like really specific. So hidden Jews. So the Spanish Jews that descend into the conversos, they become actually what we see as really elite populations. Not only are they nobility, but they're starting to populate the royal administrations. One of those individuals is Lorenzo Galindez de Carvajal. He's the first historian for the Catholic monarchs, and his job was to write the first histories for this new imperial kingdom. Lorenzo was a first cousin of Bernardino Lopez de Carvajal, a levy. Lorenzo was said to his genealogy was so problematic, they actually decided they would make him a bastard. And so we don't know who his father was, but he was also descended of the levies. And what we know from the Royal Academy of History of looking through manuscripts, there is a record there where it indicates that Lorenzo retold a story about Antonio Nebrija. So why am I talking about Nebrija, and how does this relate to King Ferdinand? Okay, here it is. Lorenzo is in charge of producing the very first genealogies of the noble families and the first histories. Alongside of him working is Antonio Nebrija, who's previously a Jew, and he's writing the first grammar for the Spanish language. And interesting enough, the very first grammar for any European vernacular language is Castilian Spanish. And who creates that? It's a Sephardic Jew.
Right.
So when Nobrija goes to check on the printing of his first text, because the printing press is already starting to appear, but looking for the first copies of that, he also knows at the same time Lorenzo had finalized the last genealogies for families of the noble families. Nobrija starts turning through the pages because he's quite excited, like, I'm going to be memorialized. And so Nebrija looks at, he finds it. He's like, this is all wrong. Like, this doesn't name my proper grandparents. So he goes to the printing folks and says, what happened here? Lorenzo's got to fix all these problems. And they say, wave them off. Lorenzo approved this. Lorenzo wrote this, and nothing's changing. And from that record alone, from the Nebrija's story, we understand that actually Lorenzo carved out a Levy family that had shared consanguinity with one of his ancestors. And so it's the only information we have is that they carved it out, but we know that there's a first person story of how this was happening and who was doing it. And one of my favorite letters from Lorenzo, one of my ancestors, is he would often sign the letters back to the kings of Spain with, I have only done as you have instructed. So he's very, very meticulous about what his job was. And his job was to tell the story that they wanted to hear.
Right. So interesting. Okay, I'm going to go into some other questions now. And not all of them can be answered, I'm sure, but how many generations before getting the purezza de sangre, the purity of blood?
Oh, this is such a great question. I love it. Okay, so we all know this infamous name of Torquemada, right?
Yes.
Torquemada, the very first general inquisitor, the head of the Inquisition in 1478. When Torquemada was given, I have a picture of it, but it's somewhere else, and I took it out of the presentation. When he received his papal bull to be named the Inquisitor, it says, okay, you're officially approved. Torquemada approved the rules at that time, which said 3 generations is sufficient. Torquemada was 3 generations clear.
So,
So what the problem is that initially they start to create rules that say maybe 1, maybe 2 generations. But by the time of Torquemada, they try to institutionalize 3 generations. And then by the early 1500s, it becomes there is no purity of blood. You're forever stained and you cannot get rid of it. It's so problematic. And there was a question about the levies here, about why the levy was not erased. The Levy's family was so prolific across Spain and becoming different families. So they became the Estranigas, they became the Ponce de Leon family, they became the Carvajales, they became the Santa Marias, so prolific that everybody knew they had this horrible lineage according to the rules. So the Pope actually had to intervene and issued a papal bull that said, yes, they're levies, but their blood is pure. Yasta, nothing more. And so this allows this kind of like complete like disbelief, which is because the Pope says it, that's why.
so interesting, all of this. Please continue to write in. There's another question here. Did they copy the Islamic taqiyya, a concept to hide your inner identity?
I love this question because I first trained as an Islamic scholar, but my Arabic was so horrible that I could not continue. So, in this respect, I do think that is a really, really great observation that, that there is an inner and an outer, right? And this is actually very interesting that you asked this question because medieval Islamic civilization went through its own renaissance much earlier than Christian civilization. So we think of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad in the 800s and 900s, and we think about the development of the different caliphates where they're trying to bring in as much Greek knowledge and expanding that. They, in many ways, were experimenting with these ideas of different kinds of identities. And because they're a convert community as well, they had the same problems. So I think they experimented with it first. And then I think by the time that the Europeans kind of catch up, because the European Renaissance is based off Islamic sciences, Islamic philosophy, that then they kind of encounter these new ideas and they start actually taking on it. So in some respects, this is that argument, I think, for the Abrahamic faiths, right? That there really is no kind of purity in any of these, actually, that they're borrowing from each other and using them in ways that will work for their contemporary period. And for the Conversos, and I think for Spanish Jews as well, we see when they go out into the Mediterranean world, once they leave Spain, especially in that book by Richard Kagan about Sephardic Jews in the Mediterranean, when they go to Rome, they live as Jews. When they go to Salonika, they live as Jews. But when they go back to Toledo, they live as a Christian because you have to.
Right. And it's kind of the outer secret that people know but don't know. That's
Yeah. Lovely
um,
question. Really, really good question.
yeah, she's been sending in, or sorry, that person's been sending in a few. So thank you, and please do continue. You mentioned a term called anti-pope. Can you explain that?
Sure. So, I mean, I mention this because, in Catholic society, the idea that, you have one supreme religious leaders is an old concept. And, that we all have heard about, and it's been some time, there's that Council of Cardinals, the College of Cardinals, who elect a pope. Now, sometimes the church, as we see even today, is at war with itself. And often, as we can imagine, it's a human institution. And so during the 1400s and 1500s, something really interesting is happening in Spain and France and in England and in Germany, is that the Roman Catholic Church is starting to come apart, that there's so much significant corruption across the church that we start to see the beginnings of the Protestant Revolution. And so this is where actually it's the world of like great powers, where the French King Louis realizes, if I can install my own pope inside the papacy, that will give me more authority to counter the Spanish monarchs who are on the rise. And so it's actually, it turns out it's French cardinals and the French king that align with a converso Spaniard to declare himself the Pope. And this happens because the old Pope is on his deathbed and you think he's about to die, and he doesn't. He doesn't. And so he's kind of left holding the bag there at the end. So we call him an anti-pope because he's not technically a pope and he can't be. And so that hierarchy stays in place. It's so bad in the end, which I love about this, is that he loses this quest for the papacy. And again, I really do think of him as my first Jewish pope because he is, in this way, he was trained by the levies about how to be a good Catholic. Before that, they did not know how really. The Carvajals were noblemen that were caballeros, they were knights. They had never spent any time in religious orders at all. But in the 1400s, side by side, the levies and the levies trained the Carvajals how to worship, how to practice religion. And so, Bernardino like comes out of this like excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church. He and about 3 or 4 other cardinals are excluded, kicked out. And of course, like all human institutions, the Pope dies. A new Pope comes in and says, you can come back in.
Right. Right. When you have that centralized power, those are the kinds of things you can do.
Yeah.
Um, just a technical question. You said that the copy of the Alhambra, showed us a copy of the Alhambra decree. Where are those kept? Are there multiple original copies of them, or?
Fantastic question, really. So the way we can think about the Alhambra decree is, now as we remember, Fernando and Isabel take up residence in the Alhambra. They have to negotiate a very elaborate treaty with the Islamic Nasrids to leave, and specifically because the Catholics were very, very worried they were going to deface and destroy the Alhambra, and they wanted their prize. So this is why it's so important. We call it the Alhambra Decree, is because the Alhambra continues to exist and move forward under a Catholic administration. And there, from that location, multiple letters now are sent out. So almost every city in Spain of any significance would receive a copy of the Edict of Expulsion. So we have multiple copies everywhere. So often where we find these today are actually in municipalities. So little municipalities often have their own municipal archives. Those usually are some of the oldest royal records we can find. And those usually go back all the way to about 1100. And the reason why they have those is because they're trying to protect their privileges. They get these fueros, these city council charges that allow them to live a certain way. So alongside of those, this is where we'd see these letters coming in and being preserved there. And in this specific example is a copy that is held by the national libraries in Spain. It was probably one that was probably picked up from one of the local churches, or local communities.
Right. Do you have time for one more question?
I have any time you have.
Okay, so in the Azores, the cult of the Holy Spirit is spread. It started in Spain. Do you think there's a link with the Jews? The Ruach and the Holy Spirit are the same concept for the Jews of this time?
I think the instinct is the right instinct, right? In the sense that we tend to think of our ancestors as not particularly sophisticated, that we are at the cusp of human civilization in terms of knowledge, of rationality, of being quite smart and sophisticated. I think humans have always been quite sophisticated. And because Jewish communities and the Converso communities are coming out of this Renaissance period and figuring out how new ways of doing things that allow them to kind of be prosperous and to move through society in ways that are prosperous, they use tools like this to kind of, I don't know, make things a little bit more opaque. It's much easier in this way, I think, and this is why I've spent a lot of time looking at Marianism recently, is that it's easier for the converso to say, I'm a believer and never really speaking much about Christ, but focusing one's attention on some other interceding party that is our connection to the divine. And so that happens with Mary. But I also think, in the sense of really thinking about the Holy Spirit, it's even more esoteric, right? This is an area of, Kabbalah, then even. I think it's the area of like the mystical world. And so I think it would make perfect sense. One of the places that would be interesting to look there for the Azores is to think about early cofradias, so like brotherhoods. They're like brotherhoods of families that get together and they do different kinds of religious events together. But embedded in those, we see those in New Mexico, but also in Spain and in South America. They will actually, you'll find conversos that bind together and they do hybridized practices. So there could be, I would think, in the Azores, probably there's one or two cofradias or hermandades, brotherhoods, where there are lots of conversos in there, and there might be a connection there that would suggest, oh, they chose to really push the Holy Spirit up to the top, and that doesn't look particularly suspicious.
Right. Right. Thank you. There's a lot here to unpack, and yes, you will receive a link to the recording afterwards. Thank you, Dr. Martínez-Dávila, and thank you all for joining us here today. We hope you continue. This is just the tip of the iceberg right here. We're just beginning the conversation, and we hope that you continue to follow because there's a lot more to unpack here, and we look forward to seeing you for the next few weeks. So thank you
Great.
again.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much again for the invitation and for y'all's attention. It makes me delighted to be here with you. Thank you.
Have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody.